everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here. Um, Kevin Teeroovengadum, our guest speaker for tonight, Mr. Perma, the chairman of Whitefield, Noor and Sachita, my colleagues, my partners at Whitefield. Dear guests, special, you can't hear me. Yeah, when you talk about economics, that's usually what happens, you know. Even now it should be fine. You see, that's something that happens to you. You know, there's things keeps changing always, right? And that's an example of what happened. It's called uncertainty. You know, whatever you plan, it doesn't go according to plan, because in this world there's only one thing which is constant. It's called change, right? Just to tell you, you know, in 1942, I guess, Einstein gave his students a paper, a question paper. And his colleague said, you know, Mr. Einstein, professor, it's exactly the same paper which you gave all the students last year. Don't you think there's at least something wrong in doing that? And Einstein said, no, actually it's right. Is it the same paper? Yes, it's exactly the same paper. But what has changed? The answers has changed. You see, the question is the same, but the answers has changed. Because whatever surrounds us, this environment is very, very dynamic. And if you don't watch out, you know, you can be caught offside. The World Cup is coming, right? So you will be caught offside if you don't watch out. So as a business school, you know, that's something that we do. We always give back to society because we exist as a business school because of society, because of all of you. So at some point of time, we have to give something back. And Kevin was very kind and approached us and said, I want to speak to the students. And we said, let's open it to the public as well. So thank you very much, Kevin, for joining us. And I'll just introduce to you, you know, teacher, you can't help it to keep speaking all the time. So let me introduce you to the speaker, right? So I'm losing a bit my eyesight, sorry for that. So Kevin has 20 plus years. He stays mostly in Africa and in Europe most of the time. So he has 20 plus experience in Africa and work in close collaboration in the field of investment banking and private equity in Africa. And he's also a specialist in real estate since 2006. And he's founder CEO of the first yielding African real estate fund. And he's also a speaker at various conferences in Africa. There's quite a lot to say, but I summarized it, and we'll be glad to share the profile of Kevin with you all. But I'm sure the speaker needs no introduction. You've all heard him on radios and in the press. So we're glad to invite you, Kevin, for your keynote. Thank you, and enjoy the conference.
Afternoon, everybody. I guess for a lot of you who actually don't know me, you probably think I'm pretty virtual on Facebook, on radio, on whatever, newspapers, etc. But I do exist, so I'm here. And I think maybe before we get into the gist of it, just as a background, obviously I'm Mauritian, but I've lived pretty much 50% of my time overseas, mostly in Africa. So I've worked around 22 years on the continent, from Cote d'Ivoire, West Africa, to Kenya, Djibouti, Angola, Nigeria, etc. So my passion is actually Africa. And then when it comes to Mauritius, even though I'm miles away from Mauritius, I'm still involved with Mauritius on a number of fronts. First of all, in 2006, I sort of helped the setting up of Afrasia Bank in Mauritius. So some of you might know it's a bank which didn't exist 16 years ago. and then also involved with a number of real estate developments in Mauritius, for example, Azuri, which is in Rivière du Rempart, or Radisson Hotels, etc. So my involvement with Mauritius, in a way, keeps me in touch with Mauritius, obviously, for obvious reasons. Besides coming here on holiday, I do get involved with boards of companies in real estate, hotels, financial services, etc. And then the last 19, so 19, 20, 21, 24 years, I've started writing on the Mauritian economy, basically. So whenever you see an article in Defi Media or News on Sunday, Sunday Times, L'Express, or Business Mag, normally it means that I haven't slept, I couldn't sleep, and I sort of wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and I start writing about what I think is happening in Mauritius, but also what's happening overseas and the impact on Mauritius. Now, the last 4 years, when obviously writing a lot of articles, etc., what I found is it's very difficult to have a proper analysis of the economy, the economic situation, because basically the environment doesn't allow you to have a proper analysis. So very often we love to hear good news, like everything is fine, hotel is doing well, financial services is doing well, everybody's sort of richer today compared to 3-4 years ago. But we don't actually go deep inside to try to understand what really has been happening in the economy and what do we think is going to happen in the future and whether we should stay course or whether we should change. So I think what I wanted to do today, maybe before getting into Mauritius, is to talk a bit more about what's happening globally, because don't forget, we're a small island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, far from everywhere else. So we 4 hours to South Africa, 6 hours to Dubai, 11 hours from the UK or 12 hours from the UK. So we're very far from everything else. And very often I feel we're disconnected with what's happening overseas. And for me, that's very important. Why? Because whatever happens overseas does have an impact on Mauritius. So I'll give you an example. 2007/2008, the financial crisis, the great financial crisis that started back in the States and the UK and eventually Europe with Lehman Brothers, etc., started the end of 2006. And I was coming to Mauritius every month or every 2 months for board meetings. And the whole of 2006, 2007, up to probably June, July 2008, it was bizarre that nobody was talking about the potential impact of the great financial crisis. And I found it really bizarre. I was like, but I was in London last week, and things are very gloomy, and you guys should prepare yourselves about what's going to happen. And then obviously, it happened. And at the time, the Minister of Finance had to come up with a lot of solutions, financing, etc., etc. So that theme, I do see that quite often, i.e., we don't look beyond our shores, and then we're surprised when something happens. So what I wanted to do this afternoon or early evening is to give you a glimpse of what's happening globally, and then also so that you can actually prepare yourself as well for next year, which will be a tough year, 2023. But also, I think it's important to understand the global macro changes that's currently happening, because a lot of things are going to be very different with a lot of geopolitical changes globally. So, yeah, we've covered that, that's fine. So I'm going to cover 3 things. We've got quite a number of slides. We can do it 2 ways. Either we wait till the end and then you can ask me questions, or else if you've got questions related to specific slides, you can raise your hand as well. I can try to answer as many questions as possible. Yeah. So let me start with global. First of all, in human history, we got independence in 1968. We've been in control of our economy, but 68 to 2022 is a very short period of time, extremely short. Yet we think it's a very, very long time, but extremely short. If you look at human history, for example, if you look at the 100 years, nearly sort of 100 years, nearly 80 years actually, since we've had the World War II, that was the 1940s. That war basically defined the whole financial system that we have today. With a superpower being the US, obviously, they came out of that. They created the United Nations. That's when it happened, only 80 years ago. Yet, when we look at the United Nations, we might think that it's been there for 1,000 years, but yet it's only 80 years old, very young. Then we had the Bretton Woods, two institutions, World Bank, IMF. I'm sure you've heard about these institutions. Every time we hear the World Bank is saying this is going to happen to the economy, or the IMF is going to give us money, etc. Those two institutions, again, very young, only 80 years old, and they came out post-World War. Then we had the reconstruction of Europe, because Europe was decimated, as you know, back in the 1940s. So after the World War, we had a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of initiatives going to reconstruction of Europe. And when I talk about Europe, it's not just Germany or France, but it basically boils down from West to Eastern Europe, including part of Russia or ex-Soviet. Then we experienced Cold War 1.0. I'm just judging by the crowd. Who's got gray hair? Who would remember the Cold War? Probably people who are sort of 40 plus or 50 plus. Cold War 1.0 was basically a choice between either you choose the West or you choose the East. At the time, the East was China and Soviet, which is today Russia. Yeah. Then we had, in the 60s, the independence of ex-colonies, Africa, including Mauritius. I mean, we got our independence in 1968, but most of the African countries got the independence in the early 1960s. And it's interesting on that point, because if you look at Africa, for example, they were ex-colony of the Brits, the French, the Germans, Portuguese, the Italians, the Spanish. Sort of five, oh, the Belgians. I keep forgetting them as well. Yeah. So you had 5 or 6 ex-colonial masters. The biggest was obviously the British Empire, the Brits. Yeah. And it's interesting because when we talk about Africa today, which is divided into 54 countries, we forget and basically it's only 140 years approximately ago, when the colonial masters basically divided Africa, they took a map at the Berlin conference. They had a conference in Berlin. They sat down, UK, France, Germany, etc. They said, okay, you're going to take this, we're going to take that, we're just going to divide Africa into multiple parts. That's why you've got so many different countries in Africa. And obviously in the 1960s and 70s, then they basically pulled out, you know, in terms of control of the politics, etc. That's another point. I'm sure you must have seen that as well a couple of days ago. We've exceeded the 8 billion. Can you imagine, only in 80 years, we've gone from 2 to 8? I mean, it's just mind-boggling. We're only 1.2 million people in Mauritius, but in the world it's 8. And if we blink our eyes, we come back 10 years from now, it's going to be 9, and then it goes to 10. So it's just phenomenal. And then we went into the baby boomer generation. The youngsters, you should talk to your parents or your grandparents. They were part of that baby boomer generation. And today we've come to the next phase, which is the aging. If you look at Europe, you look at the US, you look at Mauritius, for example, you know, clearly, whenever I come to Mauritius, I see more people with gray hair, as opposed to Africa, where there are lots of young people still popping up. And then the US dollar, I mean, we take it as granted. The US dollar became the reserve currency only over the last 80 years again, built behind the World Bank, the IMF, and the whole international payment system, the SWIFT system, which we need to transact when we need to pay somebody overseas. We pay in dollar predominantly, and we use the SWIFT system. And then I'll talk later about the dealing from the dollar, but at some point in time in the 70s, the dollar got de-linked from the gold system. Everything was backed by gold until the 70s, and then they decided basically to de-link from the gold and push the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. Most transactions are done around the world, obviously in US dollar. And then 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we had the GATT. For those who could remember, if you did your studies back in the 90s, which I did, for example, this was the big thing at the time, the general agreement on tariffs and trade. You know, the World Trade Organization, 1990s as well, very, very young, only 30 years, basically. Yeah. And we all know where they sit. They sit in the US. Then in the 90s, we started having regional blocs. So imagine all the countries were fragmented. And then from 1990, so 30 years ago, we started having regional blocs. They started all happening at the same time. NAFTA, North Agreement Free Trade, Canada, US, Mexico. Then the EU, I mean, it started as EU7, then it became EU14, now it's EU22, EU27, etc. And then the Asian Pacific, APEC, and then nearer to us, as you would know, SADC, COMESA, African Union, and then ASEAN, which is in Asia as well. And then after that, we started having new currencies coming to play. So the euro, I mean, we all know euro is also a reserve currency, but again, the euro is only 22 years old, very, very young. I mean, just came out from a young teenager, basically, as we speak. And then you've got other currencies as well, the pound and the Japanese yen. And then we had the dismantling of the Soviet bloc. Again, if you were here in the 80s and the early 90s, the big Soviet bloc got dismantled, and a lot of countries, which you can see now with the war that's currently happening in Ukraine, etc. But if you look at countries like Georgia, Moldova, Croatia, ex-Yugoslavia, etc., all these were part of the Soviet bloc, and that's only 30 years ago. These countries basically got dismantled from the Soviet Union, and then we have what we have today, which is the Eastern European countries, basically. 20 years of globalization, I would say good 20, 25 years of globalization. What do I mean by that? Globalization, if you're young, you were born in globalization. You wouldn't know how it was 30 years ago in terms of trade, basically. You couldn't just manufacture and export because you had tariffs, you had taxes on the other side, etc. People couldn't move freely as you have today. So in Mauritius, for example, you've got Africans coming to work here in Mauritius. You couldn't have that 20, 30 years ago. Or Mauritians couldn't go overseas to work, etc. You know, so you have a lot of Mauritians in the financial services sector who go to Luxembourg to go and work currently. You couldn't have that kind of thing. You had obviously illegal immigrants going, but formally speaking, you couldn't have that. But all this is due to globalization. So you started having movement of people, goods, services, and even industries as well. Terrorism, that's something which, interestingly, it was sort of there, but it became globalized 20 years ago with 9/11. They got their brand, like Nike, they got their money, they got their bags, they got the flashiest cars ever, the best arms, etc. So that's also part of globalization. They also got really, really globalized. And then the same over the last 80 years. We've moved from industry 2.0, 3.0, we're currently 4.0, and we're even talking 5.0 during this decade. 4 different types or different phases of industries in 80 years, and the last 2 basically over 15 years. We're talking about space economics. You must have seen, back in the days, the only guys that were launching rockets in space were the NASA, and then the French, and then obviously these days you've seen the Chinese, the Indians, including even the private sector. Elon Musk is sending rockets in space because that's the next big trillion-dollar economy is actually in space. Most of the mining that we know that's currently happening on this planet is going to happen in space going forward. And that's why you see a lot of effort by big players, whether it's governments like China, I'll cover that later, and even private sector like Elon Musk, like even Jeff Bezos, etc., because they know that's the next big thing coming. So in terms of what's happening in the world as well, we all know the US is the big brother. I mean, they're by far ahead of every other countries in the world. In terms of the US dollar, in terms of intellectual property, in terms of military might, in terms of military bases around the world. That's the reality of it. I mean, the US is number one. Unfortunately for Europe, bad news, the Europe that we know of, and I know Mauritians love Europe. Whenever we go on holiday, we go to France, we go to the UK, we go to Germany, we've got relatives living in Italy, etc. But in my travels, I travel a lot. Europe is old. The infrastructure is declining. The currency is under pressure. They haven't reset in terms of what they want to do next, basically. And politically, there's a lot of things happening in Europe that's going to create a lot of problems in the next 20 years. So for me, Europe is on the decline. Asia, this is one thing which is interesting because obviously we're next door to Africa, so we love talking about Africa, but we rarely talk about Asia. Very rarely talk about Asia. For me, when I look at all the continents, if I have to put my money, that's where I'll put my money, is Asia. The biggest changes are happening there. Youth, big young population, 4.5 billion people, more than 50% of the world's population is in Asia, and far more technologically advanced than Europe. So for me, this is the real McCoy, basically, for this century. It's Asia's century. And when I talk about Asia, it's not just China. It's China, India, but also Southeast Asia, so Indonesia, Philippines, etc. Africa, continent which we have spent more than 20 years. Africa has got amazing resources, but it's just going to take a lot of time, unfortunately. Africa doesn't have the dynamics of Asia. Africa is not like China because we've got too many countries, too many different presidents, too many geopolitical forces at play, ex-colonial masters, new colonial masters coming in, etc. So Africa is going to they're going to develop at their own pace, basically. South America, it's another continent we don't talk a lot. You must have seen last week, or 2 weeks ago, there was elections in Brazil. You've seen Argentina basically pretty much bankrupt, and there are lots of things happening as well in countries like Peru, Chile, etc. There, given its proximity to the US, also given, as you know, a number of countries are quite dysfunctional in terms of the formal and informal economy. So for me, that's kind of a continent that's going to tag along, basically. So I don't expect any miracle coming out of Latin or South America. I wanted to show you that graph, basically, for you to understand what's the connection with globalization. If you take, for example, in the 1980s, that's the US, interest rate was 20%. And then every systematic year or every 2 years or 3 years, interest rates started going down. And that's what's been the backbone of globalization, because for people to consume at 20% interest rate, you couldn't afford to take credit. I mean, I'm sure you remember 15 years ago, interest rate was like 15%. You couldn't go and buy something and then pay 15% over the next 5 years. You have to save money before you spend it. So that's the way it was pre-1980. And then as rates started going down, that helped basically people getting access to credit. Access to credit basically means you can buy now, pay later. And then more importantly, for those who are younger generation, you only live once, YOLO. So buy now. Who cares? Who's going to pay? We'll figure it out. Yeah. So if we look ahead in terms of this coming decade, what's ahead of us? 2019, the first paper, I think it was the first paper I wrote in L'Express, or was it Le Défi anyway, one of these, in August 2019. I wrote a paper saying basically this decade will be a decade of global conflicts. There's going to be a lot of conflicts in terms of economic fight, in terms of wars, in terms of geopolitics, and obviously will have repercussion on Mauritius, basically. And we are seeing that already happening. So Ukraine, Russia is one, we're seeing US, China is another one, and we're seeing as well, even close to us in a way, even sort of India, China as well is potentially another conflict. Hopefully not. But so for 40 years, the last 40 years, it's almost we had a good time actually. We had pretty much global peace. Okay, some people would say, yeah, but there was war in Iraq, there was war in Syria, but as long as it happened somewhere else, not in your backyard, it was fine. It's not in my home, basically. So we had relative peace for the last 40 years. Unfortunately, it doesn't last. History has demonstrated, if you go over 2,000 years or 1,000 years, for example, we've seen periods of peace and then basically tension, wars, peace, tension, wars. Always happen. So if you go 1,000 years, for those who've studied history, as an example, we had the Portuguese, we had the Spanish, for example, who were great empires. They went and conquered the world. We had the Dutch. I mean, they sort of finished all the dodo on the barbecue, but they fought. At some point in time, the Spanish and the Portuguese were up, then they went down, the Dutch up, and down again. China of today, that's up, they were up, then down again for the last 200 years. So it's constantly, basically, you have these changes. So now my view is we've reached the end of global peace. And that's why for the last couple of years, especially this year, you're hearing, you're seeing, and you're probably watching a lot of more wars basically happening in places we never thought of. We never thought of because the last 40 years we had global peace. But it's going to happen, and it's happening. For me, the biggest change is US versus China. This is the biggest play. At least I'm getting to see it at my age, but the younger generation, you're going to be part of that, basically. The big question is whether those two countries will be able to agree how to share the global cake. That's what, bottom line is that. There's a cake. Do you agree to share, or do you want to take it all? If it's the latter, then we're going to end up in war. If it's the former, we'll find a way of working out, and everybody will benefit from that. The issue is we are in for years of friction. This friction hasn't started today, by the way. Even before COVID, for example, during the Trump administration of 2016 and 2020, we had a lot of trade wars between the US and China. It was basically playing ping pong. I put duties on your goods, you put duties on mine, I put another, etc. It went on for 4 years. And now, obviously, you must have seen the friction is sort of happening in a way, so much so that you're seeing basically the US and China having almost weekly sort of mini fights. When I say mini fights, it's diplomatic fights. They will send a couple of planes, the others will send a couple of submarines, they'll do a couple of nuclear tests, etc. China will use North Korea, the US will use Taiwan. You're seeing that happening in front of you. So currently, this year, my view is we're officially in a Cold War without knowing. We're seeing that already. You have to choose. Let me give you an example. 2 years ago, for those, don't want it to be polemic, for those who decided to be vaccinated, you had to choose. Do you choose a vaccine from the West, or do you choose a vaccine from the East? If you chose a vaccine from the East, you couldn't travel to the West, and vice versa. So that war had already started, that Cold War. Okay. And now, obviously, this year, we're seeing a Cold War happening with Ukraine and Russia. Same story again, which happened back in the Soviet days. So I'm sure you've heard this one. Obviously, when the US sneezes, the world catches a cold. We've heard this over the last 80 years. But then I say, when China sneezes, which they did in 2020, the world goes into lockdown. That's the reality of it. I mean, we're laughing about it, but that's the reality. My problem is, if those two, the US and China sneeze, we're in big shit, honestly. And I hope we don't get there. If they do, If they fight each other here, it's going to be horrible. So when I saw, for example, the G20 summit a couple of days ago, how President Xi was basically shaking hands, or rather, let me put it the other way, how everybody else was trying to shake hands, etc. It gives me a sense of comfort. Hopefully something positive is going to come out of it, and we're not going to end up in both sneezing. So what does it mean for this decade? We're going to have lots of turbulences, unfortunately. It's almost like a pilot. You know, you're flying a plane and you've got turbulence, you've got fog, very poor visibility, so which basically means you need to have your hands on the joystick or whatever it is, just to make sure you can control the plane. So it's the same story here. When it comes to the economy, you need, or when it comes to your company, you need to be able to take control and monitor what's happening globally, look at the impact, and make sure that you can actually get through the fog. And those fogs are going to last for the next 10 years at least. I've mentioned about geopolitical flashpoints. Back in the days, we used to see fights happening, like I said, in the Middle East or North Africa, very far from us, basically. But now we're seeing multiple flashpoints, by the way. In 2022, obviously everybody's sort of looking at Ukraine and Russia, but there are far more than that. If you look at Africa, for example, flashpoints in Mali, flashpoints in Chad, in Niger, Central African Republic as well, Somalia, Kenya borders, Ethiopia, Egypt, Eritrea. So all these are flashpoints, basically, on one continent. Yeah. I can do the same as well for other places as well. Yep. But if I had put a map, you'll probably see around a good 20 to 25 flashpoints, geopolitical flashpoints happening as we speak. So it's not just Ukraine and Russia as the only flashpoint. There's more than that. Yeah. So the big question for me is, what's going to happen? Is the world going to be divided into 2 or 3 parts? What does it mean, 2 or 3 parts? Will we have basically, we'll have a choice between the West or the East, or people who stand neutral? For example, if you look at India currently, amazing. Diplomatically, probably they are the best currently. They're neutral. They're saying, I'm not going to choose. South Africa, same story, neutral. But they're getting hit by the West, but they're playing a neutrality. So what does it mean? For me, it means basically the globalization as we've known for the last 40 years, which is basically movement of people, trade, whenever you want, etc., is going to change. It's going to have an impact on globalization. So we're moving towards deglobalization, for example. I mean, you can see already a number of European companies are moving the factories away from China. That's deglobalization, for example. You might have seen last week or the week before, Canada basically telling the Chinese to get out of strategic mining companies, for example. 5 years ago, I'm sure you've heard, Canada and Australia basically started banning Huawei. That was the start, but now it's happening much, much quicker in other industries, for example. The US have passed the CHIP Act. In your phone, in your microwave, in your washing machine, in your car, a lot of the electronic stuff that's inside there, the chips, etc. Basically, you can see the fight happening on these things, basically, where the US and Europe are saying, we cannot allow China to control all these, and Chinese are also saying the same thing. We cannot allow the West to control those important ingredients to make our electronic goods. So what does it mean? So deglobalization leads to protectionism. So you're seeing that already. I told you about the vaccine, for example, some kind of protectionism. And now we're seeing protectionism in terms of manufacturing of specific strategic goods and services. And then reshoring and onshoring basically means what you've sent to China, you're bringing them back. Either you bring them back to the UK, you bring them back to France, or else you bring them back to your borders, near your borders, which might be, for France, might be Morocco. Morocco, which is having an economic boom because a lot of the European car manufacturers are moving back from China and Asia and moving their production facilities to Morocco. So if you go to Morocco, amazing boom that's currently happening there. And then the protectionism is around technology. So you will have to make a choice. Are you going to be on the iPhone or are you going to be on the Huawei, for example? Are you going to be using Facebook or are you going to be using TikTok, for example? Okay. I mean, there are so many different examples of tech protectionism that's currently happening. And then the last one is around energy, because this is so critical. If you can't control the input to making energy, then you don't have an economy. So all the things that you're currently seeing on TV about oil and gas and COP27 and renewables, etc., is about who's going to control the source of energy. And this is where the big fight, unfortunately, is going to happen as we speak. So for me, pre-COVID, post-COVID, 2020, I will always remember, if I live another 40 years, for me, the world has changed on the 1st January 2020. So for those who are thinking like we might go back to how it was in 2019 or 2018, finito, forget it. It's not going to happen. Move on. And even for Mauritius as well, as an economy, we need to realize that is how do we make a better economy in this new world? Couple of slides on China. I think for me it's very important. And by the way, I'm not paid by the Chinese embassy. I'm not sponsored by Huawei or whatever. My phone is an iPhone. So just to let you know. Top left is China's GDP as a percentage of the world GDP. I mean, nearly 1% 30 years ago. And now basically it's around 16, 17%. And it's going to be 20% by 2025, 2026. On the right, I wanted to do that. I wanted to put that so that you understand. Because obviously we've got Mauritius, some kind of connection with India. Mother India, as we call it. Same population, two big countries, etc. But the bottom line is, in 1990, up to 1990, 32 years ago, India's GDP per capita was ahead of China. And then the blue line, which is in the 90s here, you can see, I mean, there's no comparison. India is no match. I mean, that's the reality of it. There are two different societies, two different type of people, two different type of political system. If you had to put your money 30 years ago, it's China, not India. India is going to plug along. I mean, we talk a lot about India, et cetera, but the bottom line is China is a different league compared to India. You can see the difference there on GDP per capita. And then the bottom on the left here, sorry, it's not because of the light. The blue bars is the USA, and the sort of gray or red, whatever reddish, I'm colorblind, so you're all white anyway. Sort of reddish is China. You can see the number of scientific papers published between the US and China. Look where they were in 1996, completely down, and look at 2020. So the China of, you know this thing we always think, oh, you know, they just take stuff and then they dismantle, they copy, and then they paste and whatever. They don't invent anything, etc. It's total nonsense. Yeah. If they're doing those kind of scientific research, and then we're surprised that they launch on the 25th or 26th of February, as the war started in Ukraine, they launch around 20 rockets in space in one day. So the reason I'm saying that to you is you need to understand where they came from and why I believe going forward, this is the new superpower. And we'll have to deal with China, we'll have to work with China. And then on the right, the red bar is China, basically, is the number of space launch done by China versus the other countries. So it's not the China of copy-paste T-shirt at $1, by the way. Yeah, it's a different China we're dealing here. Here, if we look on the left, this one, over the last 7 years or 8 years, China's contribution to economic growth, 38% alone to the global growth. You put the US and the West, the main countries in the West, it's only 25%. So you can imagine if China goes into recession tomorrow, it's going to be worse than the global financial crisis. So let's hope they don't get into recession. On the top right, you will see China on the top there again. This is the supply chain of lithium battery. So whatever goes into your electronic vehicles or anything electronic. Yeah. You can see the basic in terms of supply chain, they're number one pretty much on everything. Why? Because they're strategic, they're new. Because you need to control the stuff. If you don't control the raw materials, you don't control the ship that gets the raw material from A to B, etc. You don't control the factories, you don't control the energy, then you're weak. That's what they did. They basically ensure that they control all these strategic things of strategic value chain. And then the bottom right, this one gives you China's gold reserves. Now, that's interesting because it's only this year, let's say this year, with the Ukraine-Russia war, we've seen how the US and Europe disconnected Russia from the payment system. We've seen how the US basically took billions of dollars of gold reserves from Russia because the gold was sitting at the Federal Reserve, basically. But the Chinese were not born yesterday. We keep forgetting they've got thousands of years of civilization. So they knew what was coming, and they've started preparing way back since 2009, 12 years ago, because they know this history repeats itself. They know at some point in time there will be wars between certain countries, etc., and they needed to make sure they've got a lot of stock of gold. The China before, just a couple of pictures. It's only 60 years ago. No, sorry, not 60 years ago, 50 years ago. Famine in China, for those who remember. I say a lot of youngsters, you won't remember, but you can Google afterwards. Huge famine, and then what they've done over 4 decades, nobody has ever done that in the world. 4 decades, 40 years. So I'm 48, so my 4 decades, basically. 800 million people out of poverty. And the China today, this is what it is. Obviously, Shanghai, magnetic train, the fastest magnetic train, the biggest solar power plant, floating power plant. They are ahead of the race in terms of 6G. I'll talk about that afterwards. The US didn't want them to be on the space station, so they created theirs as well. And then military might, you know, and then obviously AI and robotics. Over 50 years, they've done it. So if you still think about China making, you know, the $1 or 100 rupee T-shirt, etc., wake up. To give you, in terms of solar manufacturing value chain, the red part of the pie is basically what China controls. So people who say that China is polluting the, obviously, you know, etc., they're not into renewables, they should actually look at exactly what China is doing. 5 of the top 10 hydropower plants are in China. 4 of the top 10 biggest solar power plants are in China, and they've just started, yeah. Oh, this one, I don't know if you remember that one. A couple of weeks ago, there was the Chinese Communist Party meeting. So it was interesting. So Xi was there, the premier was there, and the ex-president as well. And he was, whatever it is, whether he was sick or whether he was told to move out, it was interesting because for 2 weeks, nonstop, all the mainstream media were only talked about how a dictatorship has taken control of China. Because why? Because they booted the ex-president out, and obviously President Xi has managed to get his 3rd mandate. Surprise, surprise. Even the global political leaders made a lot of statements like dictatorship, and it's not what we aspire to be, it goes against democratic values, etc. So that was 3 weeks ago. And then last week, or this week, The same people at the G20. Everyone queued up to shake this guy's hand. President Xi was basically, in all the media, the most talked about president at the G20 summit. So there must be a reason why. You know, when you look at whether it's Biden, obviously it was a very, very important meeting because they haven't met for a number of years, given the Taiwan issue. Whether it's President Macron, whether it's even the Australian guy, or the new Italian lady, etc., or even Modi. So what I'm trying to say here is 20, 30 years ago, or even 10 years ago, it was unthinkable. People would queue up to shake hands. You know, with the same guy where 2 or 3 weeks ago, they were saying a dictator has taken control because of the third mandate. So the reason I'm saying this is, as I said again, I'm not paid by China, but I think for me, the message I want to pass on to you, we are in a world, very different world to the world that we've known over the last 80 years, basically. And this world is, we've got 2 superpowers, the US and China. For those who, obviously, we do have love affairs with Europe. It's part of our DNA. We watch French telly, we watch BBC News. Europe is kind of declined, as I said. You know, I don't see Europe coming back anytime soon, basically. Anyway, so that was a bit of global geopolitical context. Now, I'm going to try to go as quickly as possible on the current state of affairs of the global economy. Last year, 2021, in May or June 2021, I wrote a paper which was published in a couple of newspapers here in Mauritius. And I said, guys, the biggest danger for us in 2022 is going to be rising inflation. Obviously, stagflation. And at the time, the central bank, or the Bank of Mauritius, basically, the statistics was around 1%, 2% inflation. But then I was saying, guys, no, you need to understand what's going to happen, because you know inflation just doesn't happen overnight. It happened for a couple of reasons, basically. When we had COVID in 2020, we've had massive amount of money that's been printed by pretty much all governments. I mean, you know, in Mauritius, people didn't go to work, they got paid, right? In the US, which is the top right there, you can see 2020, which is there, and then you see a spike. $4 trillion to $5 trillion were just printed overnight and just thrown into the economy. They did the same thing as well in Europe. You can see a spike, and they did the same thing as well in England. Pretty much a lot of countries did that. So rule number 1, when it comes to inflation, it's too much money chasing too few goods. That's the basic definition. When you've got too much money, it creates inflation. So COVID 2020/21, we had massive amount of money that's been printed and thrown out in the economy. So that's number 1. Then number 2, supply side issues. So obviously we've had reshoring, a lot of production facilities being moved away from China. We've had, for example, lockdowns in China. I mean, you've seen, I'm sure, multiple ports were locked down. And every time that happened, even last week, you know, iPhone guys were struggling in terms of getting iPhone out of China because they locked the port for 2 weeks. So for me, that's why we're having a longer inflation and much higher inflation, because it's kind of a double whammy. A, you've created more demand with lots of money being printed, and then B, you've reduced supply with all these logistics issues. So high inflation is not a surprise, wasn't a surprise, and we're going to be dealing with high inflation for quite a while. When I say quite a while, for at least the next 5 years, we're going to have high inflation. And obviously you've heard, I mean, yesterday, the new Prime Minister of the UK and even his new Finance Minister mentioning the highest inflation over the last 41 years, and also officially the UK is in recession. So that was bound to happen. It's absolutely no surprise. So what are we dealing with in terms of the current state? I've put a lot of graphs on the right, etc. you can see the stuff that we're dealing with. We're dealing with wealth inequality. I'm sure in Mauritius as well, you see that happening. When I'm sort of surprised when I see sort of, I think I saw a sports car or 2 sports cars in the car park. But then people struggle with 10,000 rupees per month as well. So that's growing. Wealth inequality is real. It's happening in a lot of societies. Just to give you a stat, in France, 60 million people plus minus, 6 million people live below poverty line in France, and an additional 4 million will also go to poverty line, below the poverty line during the next year in France. So it's a global issue that's happening. At the same time, while people are going below the poverty line, on the other hand, the billionaires are getting even more billionaires. Now they're even trillionaires. So there's something that's not functioning properly in terms of sharing the global or sharing the economic pie. But that's a serious issue, which has also happened in history, by the way. For those who've studied La Révolution Française, is a classic example of wealth inequality. Was it the queen with the brioche instead of the bread, wasn't it? So you can see that happening again and again. Then rising debt and increase of interest rate. So we're seeing that globally. Debt for the country, for companies, corporates have been piling up, and then now we're seeing interest rates going up. So obviously, which puts a lot of burden on people to service their debt, and a lot of people or companies or countries are going to be caught in the debt trap. As we speak currently, there are at least 8 African countries next year that would officially go into bankruptcy, including the likes of Zambia, Ghana, a couple of others, etc. Then we know in Latin America, Argentina, and then in Middle East, Lebanon is already in default. So we are going to see more countries going to default, and obviously we're going to see the World Bank and the IMF stepping in again to help these countries. Yeah. We're seeing decoupling happening. Decoupling basically meaning, like I spoke to you about Canada, moving away from China. We're seeing China as well, which interestingly this week, they've asked their companies that are listed on the New York Stock Exchange or on the Dow Jones to start divesting, because they know at some point in time the Americans are just going to climb. So they've asked basically Chinese investors to start pulling out their listed companies out of the Dow Jones, for example. So that decoupling is already happening. The restructuring of the global energy sector, this whole thing that you're seeing in terms of Ukraine, Russia, oil, gas, obviously now with the World Cup starting on Sunday, as if we've discovered Qatar, all of a sudden, if you look at the European media outlet, all of a sudden they've realized Qatar is doing the World Cup and everybody should be boycotting Qatar. But then at the same time, they're buying gas from Qatar. Just to give you an example how sometimes it's kind of a lunatic world out there. But all that is because basically a lot of countries, a number of big superpowers are going to take control of the value chain around energy, because if you can't control energy, then you're going to be weak in terms of military, you're going to be weak in terms of economy. So that's why the next 10 years we're going to see a lot of initiatives from the US, China obviously, and then Europe in between as well, trying to control the energy sector, the global energy sector. New reserve currencies, I've said 80 years of dollar, the mighty dollar, and now we are seeing a number of countries talking about using their own currency for trade. Example, amazing trade happening between India and Russia using the Indian rupee as tradable. The same thing as well is happening between China and Russia as well. They're using their own currency. So we're going to see more and more of these happening. It's not going to be the end of the dollar, but I think at some point in time, the US will need to say, okay, you know what? I'd rather have 50% of something rather than nothing, in a way. But I think the currencies that are going to be under pressure would be the euro and the pound sterling. You've already seen the decline of those two currencies. So for me, I wouldn't buy those two. I'm not supposed to be advising you what to buy, not to buy, but I'm saying for me, okay, I wouldn't buy those two currencies because basically there's no value in the medium to long term in the euro and the pound sterling. And then obviously we're seeing new ways of international payment because we've got the SWIFT system. If you need to transfer money, it goes through the SWIFT. So which basically means The US has control of every single euro, pound sterling, dollar that goes out from one country to the other. And that's why you were seeing basically new international payments coming up live. So for example, and the Chinese were very smart there. They've done very well. I mean, everybody's on Visa and MasterCard. They created theirs, UnionPay. If you come to Africa, UnionPay is bigger than Visa and MasterCard, for example. So even in Mauritius, I think there's UnionPay, if I'm not mistaken, by State Bank. So we're going to see more and more of these new international payment system. The war stuff, I've talked about this. I think this decade, I hope we don't go into a full war. I hope global leaders will become rational and agree to settle the deal. The big question is whether the West, in a way that's been in control of the world for the last 300 and 400 years, are okay to relinquish power to other people. So what does it mean economically? So it's a lot of turbulence. The last 20, 30 years, we had a good time. It's almost like you go to a party. You dance until 5 o'clock in the morning, and then you stop the music. At 1 minute later, you realize, oh my God, you're tired. But 1 minute ago, you were dancing like crazy, for example. So we had a good 30 years, basically, globally speaking. It doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. It just basically means there's going to be a lot of turbulences, and there's going to be a lot of mini recession. Either we go for a big depression, economic depression like we had back in the 1920s and 1930s, or we go into mini recession. I think it's the latter. The reason is because basically, if we go into an economic depression, it's going to create a lot of civil unrest, which might be problematic to the world order, basically. And the global politicians are very worried about that. I mean, if you're looking at, for example, in the UK, we're getting more and more strikes. In France, France, they always had strikes anyway, but even Germany, Netherlands, countries where we never had strikes for the last 30 years, it's already happening. And that's a sign of civil unrest brewing. So I think the way forward is more kind of mini recession. So it might be 1 year recession, 2 years recovery, another year of recession, 2 years of recovery. I mean, we've had it already, yeah? 2020 recession, 2021 recovery, and now UK is officially in recession, and other countries are also in recession, getting into recession. Which brings me to this recession slide. It's almost like looking at the lights, red, yellow, or green. All the lights have turned red, basically, when you look at the major index here. So if you look at the consumer sentiment in the big countries, lowest ever over the last, even lower than the great financial crisis, so lowest ever over the last 50 years. If you look at business sentiment as well, if you look at basically, for example, new construction going down, home sales going down, interest rates going up. So it's basically just bad news over bad news over bad news over bad news. So we need to get used to the days of recession. So what does it mean? It means basically next year is going to be a tough year. Now I'm saying this because I've seen that movie before. Like I said to you, when we had the global financial crisis, it took Mauritius or the authorities a year and a half at that time to realize that it was coming. Yeah. So I hope this time it's not going to take a year and a half. They understand that it's happening so that they can actually take actions. Yeah. So you can see in terms of this, from Jan to October this year, basically from blue to green to red. So more and more countries, as we're getting at the end of the year, more and more countries, both in developed markets and emerging markets, are going into recession, contraction. Okay, quick one on this. I wanted to cover this. Why? Have you read that book, or have you heard of the guy's name, Ray Dalio? No? Yes, I see yes, some nodding. Yeah, okay. If you haven't, buy this book. By the way, I don't get paid by him either, yeah? But I'm saying it's worth, or buy one, you can share it or whatever, buy that book. Because he explains this very, very simplistically in one graph. I mean, it's a book, but Actually, I'm summarizing it in one slide, basically, for you. So for every country, globally speaking, we go through cycles. I did mention to you previously, like if you look at the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, I mean, you name it, etc. They go through cycles of being up, then they go down, then you've got new empires coming up, go down, etc. And the last 100 years or 150 years, we've had the US as the global power, basically. Now, the interesting thing is, on that graph, he analyzed a lot of countries and over almost 1,000 years, and he came up with this cycle of 18 points, basically, and it tells you where we are in the cycle and what's going to happen next. So when you look at that, even from Mauritius, for example, you will see we on that side, to give you a couple of examples why we're on that side. Look, number 13, large debt. 14, printing money. I mean, I'm sure you've heard yesterday, or was it yesterday or today, the central bank, the Bank of Mauritius injected another $100 billion. Last week they did it as well, and over the last 2 years, they almost injected around $2.5 billion of Forex. 2.5 billion, right? Internal conflict, you can see politics. I mean, matin, midi, soir is just politics, politics, politics. So it tells you what's happening. Reserve currency, you can see our reserve being depleted. As we speak, we're borrowing more money to fill in the reserve. And then leadership, and then you go into civil war and revolution. So when you look at that cycle, you look at number 1 to 8, which is there. There's nothing there for us. We're more on that side. So less productive, I'll talk about that when we talk about the economy. We're losing our competitiveness, etc. Wealth gap, you know, the poor and the super rich. Gated communities, you know, for example, and then you've got very sort of low-income houses, etc. So you can see we're there. I know it's not nice. Yeah, I'm putting that. I mean, I'm not here to bring you sort of good news for Christmas or New Year, etc. But I'm just trying to give you a picture of what's really happening, and that is happening not only to Mauritius; it's happening to a lot of countries. And that's why last year, I'm defaulting back to China again, the president came out last year and made a speech. I think it was the anniversary of the Communist Party. And in his half-an-hour speech, there was one sentence, which is around common prosperity. Why he talked about common prosperity? Because they've realized that the economic model that we've had over the last 80 years, through globalization and capitalism, etc., will push a lot of people into poverty, and that poverty will bring us to civil war and revolution. That's why you would see, was it last year, he clamped down on Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba. You remember he disappeared, and then he reappeared, and now he's super philanthropic? Why? Because he wanted to make sure that the billionaires in China, they don't become like the billionaires in the US, where they can, they can decide about who gets to tweet or not to tweet, or who gets elected or not elected, etc. Because, you know, so he wanted to send a strong sign. So he did that with Jack Ma. Then he also did it with, when I say he, or they did it with the famous Chinese tennis player as well, who was a superstar, and she disappeared because she was becoming one of these great influencers, etc. So that's why you will see the strategy they're adopting there is basically, is it out of battery? It's basically squashing those people who can create, eventually lead to revolution, etc. And that's why he's talking about common prosperity, because he wants to make sure they don't end up in a society where basically 1%, where basically 1% of people, which, for example, in the US, earn more than the 50% of the people, for example. Yep. So what does it mean from the current era and the next era? I do believe we're moving to a multipolar world. I think if you look at India's strategy, it tells you, for example, it's really happening, where India is able to trade with France, is able to trade with the UK, and the US at the same time is able to trade with Russia. So we're moving to that kind of multipolar world. And then technology, obviously, big part of our life. I think we're going to see technology being basically used in everything that we can think about. I'm super excited if I'm still around by 2027. 6G is going to be out on a testing phase. But by 2030, 6G is going to be the norm. 1,000 times faster than 5G. So, for example, in 2030, you would be able to be at home with your phone and actually dial in on holograms for this seminar. I don't know if you remember Star Trek. The guy had something and then something just popped up and he was talking to everybody. This is not science fiction. It's only 6 years away or 7 years away from now. I mean, youngsters, I mean, you wouldn't know it. I mean, you've got WhatsApp, you video call. When I went to uni, you had to send a blue mail, which took 1 month to go and back and forth, depending. So I think it's important to understand that technology is going to bring amazing changes, unthinkable changes, and a lot of jobs are going to be destroyed, unfortunately, but also it's going to create new opportunities as well. And then from a demographic point of view, aging society, I mean, you can see it in Mauritius. We clearly an aging society. We're going to have far more old people, and we're going to need to cater for the healthcare of these old people, etc. Then it's going to put pressure on taxation system as well, because we don't have sufficient young people working to be able to fund, the healthcare of these old people. And I think we're talking about CRG earlier on, for example. All these is going to put pressure on the pension fund. BRICS, wanted to put that there. BRICS, as you know, it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa 10 years ago. And now it's being expanded to these other countries as well. And more countries are going to go towards BRICS as well. So that's what I was saying to you earlier on, like, this new world is not something that might happen, it's actually happening and it's evolving in front of us. I'm sure you've heard even Saudi, for example, is joining BRICS. Yeah. So that's a major change. Okay, so 2 more slides and then I'm done. Mauritius, what does it mean? So when I look at Mauritius in all this thing that's happening globally, we've had 40 bloody good years, to be honest, from the 80s, 90s, 2000, and then up to 2020. 40 good years of growth, of prosperity. You just look at the number of cars, there's money in the system. But for me, the last 10 years, 2010 to 2020, we did absolutely nothing. For me, if I have to write a book, I will call it the lost decade. Why? Because between 2010 to 2020, for the Mauritian economy, we didn't do anything in addition to what we have already, or have had already since the 1980s, 90s, to come with new income. So what do I mean by that? Sugar was there a long time ago. Textile was there a long time ago. Tourism was there a long time ago. Financial services was there a long time ago. Can somebody tell me what have we created new the last 10 years? What pillar of the economy? Sorry? Synthetic. Oh, okay. Sorry, is that textile or? But okay. So yes, but that's consumerism, So basically nothing. So we lost 10 years, and my sort of worry is we currently. I showed you earlier on. We are on the wrong side of that cycle. And I'm not seeing anything new that's going to change that's going to bring additional income to Mauritius. It's almost like you used to plant tomatoes, you want to plant something else, but you haven't seen anything. You need to put something on the earth. If not, it's not going to happen magically. And that's my worry about Mauritius is we've done absolutely nothing in terms of new pillars of economy to give me hope that from 5 years from now, we're going to get extra income, or we're going to export something different, or we're going to have additional revenue coming from somewhere. So when I look at Mauritius in a way, obviously we're busy in our work. I mean, we do, we go to work, etc. We don't have time to actually look at the bigger picture. But for me, Mauritius, it's like, it reminds me of a ship. The ship is moving, obviously, depending where the wind blows. But we don't know. Are we going? Is it going to be an iceberg in front? Is it going to be a cliff or whatever it is? All we know, the ship is moving. So we need a sense of direction. We need a vision. I think that's what's currently lacking. And then I keep saying, there isn't a week or a month when I read the papers or I listen to the radio or I keep hearing there's a new hub being launched. Like, we're going to be the hub of pharmaceutical, we're going to be the hub of, I think 10 years ago, we're going to do motorcycles for Africa, and then we're going to be the education, health. No, but exactly. So I think it's like we say too many things, and it's almost like being jack of all trades and master of none. Basically, we just need to get one or two things right. And that's it. And let's do that properly. So what are the issues for Mauritius? Geopolitics. When we talk about Diego, we talk about Agaliga, obviously. I mean, let's not be naive. We all know the reasons why the US and the Brits are not going to give up Diego. And we all know why India is in Agaliga. I mean, let's not be stupid. And the French are next door in Réunion. I mean, the French are also in Tromblin, which is, quote unquote, part of Mauritius. So that's getting nearer to us. Aging population, like I said, more and more elderly people. Migration, I don't know about you. The last year I'm seeing a lot of my generation, 40s, leaving Mauritius, which is interesting. I remember once upon a time they used to tell their kids to go and study overseas. Now it's like they're choosing a university depending on the country where they can also migrate a lot. And these are people who've got good jobs, which is quite scary. Inability of going up the value chain for existing pillars. This one very quickly. If you look at sugar, for example, you remember we used to do basic sugar, and then it took us almost 20 years to be able to do added value sugar. Textile, we used to do t-shirts, and it took us so many years to do higher value, added value stuff. Tourism, same story. I'll give you statistics. If you look at our tourism, for example, in 2008, we were hit with a financial crisis. It was the first shock. The revenue per tourist in 2008 was around 1,100 euro per tourist. In 2019, it was around 1,100 euro. So for 11 years, we got pretty much the same amount of money from every single tourist. Costs going up, revenue pretty much the same. And if you whack inflation, in fact, you're getting less money, basically. So that's why when we talk about tourism, we say, okay, the tourists are spending more money, etc. I said, no, I can tell you because I fly a lot in Mauritius. I came in the night before. You can see our tourists are basically not the 5-star that we think they are. They're basically either a bunch of backpackers or they're basically middle class. That's the reality of it because we haven't changed tactic. If you go to Seychelles, 2021, last year, they made a choice. They said they don't want volume, they want quality. That's why you can see the strategies and the revenue that they get per tourist is much higher than Mauritius. If you go to Maldives, they're pushing kind of volume, but you can see the spend per tourist is much higher than Mauritius, almost 30% higher than tourists coming to Mauritius. So I'm using that as an example because for me, again, the tourism sector is a declining industry because we haven't done anything new in terms of repositioning, looking for new markets, or doing anything sort of in terms of branding to get sort of new clientele. Education system, I mean, you guys are in that system. I mean, for 30 years we keep talking about it, but if we change it today, it's going to take another 10 years. Yep. Imports up. People are surprised. I mean, I came in yesterday or the day before, people said, yeah, but did you see last week the central bank injected $100 million, and then yesterday they injected another $100 million? I said, it's not surprising, because we keep importing, we keep buying stuff overseas. We've got no strategy to reduce our imports. So why are you surprised that the central bank is taking money from the reserves and injecting it with the banks? Yep. Financial services, I'm sure you've seen a number of big international companies in Eben, like IQ, Sane, or Corian, etc. But you know the sad story about that in the financial services? Instead of going up the value chain, we've actually gone down, because what we're doing is the basic accounting stuff. It's taking the account from overseas, we do debit credit, and then we close the book, and that's it. And you know my worry about this one? I give it 5 years. All these youngsters who are doing debit credit, AI will do a much better job, 24 hours, work on Saturday and Sunday. So instead of going up the value chain, we've gone down for something that's going to be done in the next 5-6 years. We talk about no new pillars, the national debt. I mean, you know that better than I do. And then in terms of foreign direct investment, a lot of our foreign direct investment is basically buying properties in Mauritius. Again, non-value added, because when you buy a property, you buy a villa or you buy an apartment, the construction materials we don't produce in Mauritius. So basically you're funding something where the money is going overseas. The workers are non-Mauritian, they're Bangladeshis, it goes overseas. So they basically, it's almost like I was telling you, the water from CWA. You open the tap and then you're surprised there are only 2 drops coming out, because basically there are major leakages in the tap. Yep. And then the last one, if you look at the stock exchange, the SEMDEX, which is a measure of the performance, the SEMDEX, the index today, 2022 November, is equivalent to the number of 2007. So for 15 years, the stock exchange has been flat, basically. And a lot of us have got our money invested in the stock exchange for the pension fund. So that's why it's going to be almost impossible for the pension funds to pay our pensions in 20 years' time, because they haven't created money for the last 15 years. And then I'll talk about wealth inequality. So for me, I think when I look at Mauritius, I mean, it's not like being negative or etc., but I would love to hear from you as well. Maybe I've got it wrong. I would love to hear, what do we have as green shoots that gives us scope for opportunities, that there's light out of the tunnel, that we're going to get extra revenue coming from new economic pillars, or our kids are going to be well educated, they're going to create stuff, or they're going to do, set up technology startups, for example. What are the things, what is it that gives you confidence in the market? I mean, to be honest, I can't see it. I'll give you a difference, for example. The last 5 years, the African youth are doing amazing things in terms of technology startups. I mean, they're solving their own problems. I mean, incredible stuff, okay, right? The amount of billions of dollars over the last 3 years that's going into technology backing the African youth, I've never seen it in my 20 years of career in Africa. That's happening all of a sudden. Why? Because Africa is driven by the youth. The youth sort of waking up. They can't wait for the government to give them $100. They have to make their own plan. They don't have electricity, they don't have water, they don't have whatever, etc. So they're coming up with technology, creation of startups, etc., solving their own problems. And very often when I look at these African startups, and I also deal with a number of private sector companies here, big conglomerates, chalk and cheese. You can see the elephants in Mauritius in a way. We're having a board meeting, we're going to write the minutes of meeting, the manager will give instruction to the supervisor, whatever, etc., etc. By the time it gets done, it's 2 years later, the African youth is already well ahead of, and that's why I'm seeing so much investment going into Africa in technology, because the youth is really bringing that kind of change. And it's not, again, it's not science fiction, it's really, really happening. So to conclude, on my side, in this decade, I've told you it's a lot of turbulences, and we're part of this paradigm shift. that's happening between US, China, the New World Order. Also, a lot of countries are going through the down cycle, including Mauritius. So the questions I have, and I don't have the answers, but the question is, how do you, or do you, meaning Mauritius, how do you reposition yourself globally? What do you need to do to reinvent yourself? For example, I've talked about tourism, which again is a declining industry for me. How do we think beyond our national borders? Are there things that we can do? For example, education, we're talking about this. For me, for example, universities in Mauritius, we should have at least, in my views, we should have 50,000 African students here. 50,000 African students is nothing compared to 1.1 billion people. I mean, we should become the hub of education. But then it's not just about talking about it, we should make it happen. How do we make it happen? We need to make sure we've got flights. We need to make sure we can focus on 4 or 5 African countries and do it well. So that's one thing. It could be, tomorrow it could be about health, but then if you need health, you need to have proper hospitals, you need to have proper clinics, you need to have international investors driving that sector, for example. And then where are the talents? My big worry is the last one, is the talents. If we're getting migration of people living in Mauritius, where are the real talents going to come from? What are we going to do to attract talents? I mean, I deal a lot with private sector. Often we get a number of expatriates coming as CEOs and whatnot. A number of them are friends. Very often these expatriates come to Mauritius on a retirement package. They're already pre-retired. They're just chilling. But if you come with that mindset, you're not going to create anything new, basically. We need talents, the talents that are going to Rwanda, Kigali currently. How are they able to attract talents? How is the city of, despite what's happening in South Africa, how is it the city of Cape Town is attracting a lot of talents in the tech sector, in the renewable sector, for example? How is it Singapore has done it, etc. So for me, it's about the talents. If you create an environment to attract the talents, then the talents will deliver. So I think to end up here, I know it's Friday. There's TGIF next door. I didn't want to. I mean, my aim is not to scare you and all that. My aim was basically to give you a global picture of what's happening, the changes this decade, where we are in the cycle, and if I was a 20-year-old today, which is not, I would be worried about my future. Then the question is, if I'm a 20-year-old, is my future in this pond, or is the pond actually the bigger pond, which is the world? So a lot of youngsters, for example, in the financial services sector, are going to Luxembourg and Cayman Island to work. And I tell them, it's good for you because by going out, you get exposure, you become stronger, and then when your country is ready to welcome you back, you come back and you add value. That's the way to do it. But I think to conclude on that is I am worried about Mauritius because I'm not seeing anything new that gives me comfort in the next 5 years or 10 years. At least, if you said 10 years, at least we know. But I'm not seeing anything new that's going to change the economic direction of this island. So my money is not on Mauritius, my money is probably on Rwanda, for example. I said my money, I'm not supposed to give you advice. I don't have a license. But anyway, I'll stop here.